This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Firminish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hello, my friends. In this episode, we move once again into the tender terrain of grief. This is the second time in Life Worlds that we touch on this sensitive subject. In the previous episode with Dr. Britt Ray on eco-anxiety and loving a world in crisis, we spoke about how eco-anxiety and grief are absolutely necessary complements to all the other conversations we've been having on the show, because they directly address the psychic terrain that naturally reveals themselves when we open up to the world, when we open up to the experiences of other species, and to feeling the earth in all of its wondrous intensities and textures. As I said in my introduction in that episode, grief points us towards what we care about, towards what is priceless and irreplaceable, towards the things that make life worth living and that bring us meaning. Grief can very often be something that feels like it might break us. It can feel too immense, too dangerous, too unknown to let ourselves really feel. And yet, as it breaks us, it also breaks us open. Open and open to feel more vividly all of the beauty and passion and care we have for the world. Anais Nin has this quote that I love, and she says that the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. So we'll touch on that in some of today's conversation. We'll also touch on the history of grieving practices across different cultures and learn about active contexts in today's world where people are gathering once more through ceremony and even song to honor these temporalities of our souls. Our guest is the artist and communal grief facilitator, Alexandra Ahlay Blakey, whose work brings these mourning practices back into the collective field, using song and body through choirs and ceremonies and truth-telling. Her newest community singing album, called WAILS, Songs for Grief, was recorded with a choir of 200 voices and is completely dedicated to grief and the whales of the sea, the whales of our times, and Francis Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow and His 5 Gates of Grief. I'll kind of jump ahead and cue directly to my punchline here. I don't think we're going to get close to any culture really worth participating in unless we integrate these modalities of deeply channeling, feeling, honoring back into the weave of our culture. Our society's collective stuck grief and fear is and are anesthetics to action. They numb us. They deliver doses of paralysis and terror for youth. And they sort of act as an all too convenient numbing agent against real activism and systems change. As Ahlay reminds us, public grieving practices in the past were actually banned as they were seen to deeply threaten social and political order. We're currently living, at least in the West, where I live, a bizarre historic anomaly where we're told or made to carry our emotions very privately, quietly, behind closed doors. I was astonished to learn from Ahlay that the ancient peoples of Europe, my continent, had grief practices and even professional mourners. She's written a beautiful article I've linked in the show notes that speaks to the sacred role of professional mourners and mentions in there that in her Jewish tradition, the mikonenetz, the one who laments, embodies the pain and truth of change, and that there are long histories of lamenting women and non-binary folks who are also often improvisational poets and song bearers, and they would attend funerals and ceremonies and cemeteries and other collective ritual spaces to channel grief on behalf of the individual or community. So I ask myself, what might it look like to reestablish such customs in our society? And actually, could we even consider grief like a lost profession? And for those who are scratching their heads, wondering what on earth a grief ceremony even is, you are not alone. I have no clue myself, having not participated in one yet, obviously longing to. And I therefore ask her outright in this episode, what can be expected in one's first grief ritual? What's surprising? What patterns has she seen emerging? What outcomes can you expect? And what happens when people are holding different types of grief in the room, especially when you're in a group container? On a quick but related side note, I'm taking Frances Weller's course on grief, especially in the context of the climate movement. And in that course, he shared a few weeks ago that rituals such as these, they clue our psyche up that we are entering a different terrain, and they allow us to become transparent to the transcendent. I love that phrase. Transparent to the transcendent. And they allow us to invite in the marginalized parts of ourselves to show up, our inner outcasts, if you will, and give them their space to be heard, which I think is actually quite a beckoning invitation. And about Ahlay, what I find to be absolutely dazzling is her multifaceted artistry, and in particular her music, which has been on repeat across many of my playlists. She designs and creates living song circles as doorways into these kinds of longer grief rituals. And so we'll also discuss how communal songs can be invitations to move stagnated emotions that may lie in our bodies. And I'm curious again how sound moves grief in ways that maybe words alone cannot. And just as an example, I'll play a little tune of hers here. Feel into how these voices and words move you. Perhaps you can listen as you hold something inside of you that you've been carrying for a long time and that hasn't yet been expressed or spoken. Let's hand it over to the episode. Dear Ahlay, Lulia, Ahlay Blakely, welcome to Life Worlds and to the podcast. It's such a joy to be connecting with you this, evening for me, morning for you.
Thank you for having me.
Such a joy. I've queued up in the beginning introduction some sounds so that people could already start to hear and listen and feel some of your work and given context. And so where I'd love to start is zooming out and looking at the context through which you do a lot of your work, and this context of sort of grief rituals and the story of them throughout time, and mourning rituals, mourning being MOURN, not the morning of the daytime. So you've said, we live in a grief-phobic, grief-illiterate society and culture. And reading some things on your website was the first time I had learned of the concept that mourning once used to be a very communal act that groups and villages and towns would do together. And then it was very embedded in the community itself. And then you write in this awesome piece that grieving was pushed into the shadows. As such practices were branded superstitious or pagan, the practices were suppressed, and grief became something to be silenced, privatized, and institutionalized, which sort of gives me a bit of shivers. So I would love to just start with hearing from you directly, like, what was this context of like mourning that we used to do, or even professional mourners, which is what I've heard, and who are these people, and how did this show up in our societies before it was sort of, as you said, privatized, institutionalized, and so on?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for the digging that you did. I think I'd like to begin by clarifying that when I say these practices have disappeared, I'm specifically referring to lineages of professional mourners among people of European descent. One of the many grief tending traditions that I have been blessed to learn from is the Dagara grief ritual from Burkina Faso, West Africa. And the story of how this ritual reached the West is a very long one. But at its heart, it is about Sabomfu and Maladoma Somé, who made the profound sacrifice of leaving their home at the request of their elders. And essentially, they were asked to bring this grieving ritual here to the West as an antidote to neocolonization. It was through their elders' own experience of French colonization that they witnessed how the Western world had entirely forgotten how to grieve and had lost its connection to the ancestors. So I want to just like situate us in that, and then I'd like to start to transition towards your question, which kind of recognizes like what those elders were noticing is recognizing the irony of this wound. And for me, that's the wound of white supremacy, which includes separation from land and spirit and body and ancestors and communal practices and indigeneity long, 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 long ago. For example, Resma Menachem speaks to this in My Grandmother's Hands. He says that long before Black and brown bodies suffered harm from white bodies were inflicting harm on white bodies for centuries. So if we're looking back to the origins of this wound, the separation that began long before European colonizers set sail, there was already a rupture. We had, you know, we had the witch burnings, the separation, as I already said, of people from the land, from the commons, from community, from shared knowledge and collectivity. There was the transition to capitalism, and the abolishment of earth-based practices, the erasure of lineages and healers. And one of my deepest griefs is the dismantling of matriarchal ways of knowing. And so, if Sabomfu Maladoma's elders and ancestors are right, which I think they are, then we did indeed forget how to grieve, because our mourning practices, our meaning European descent practices, were deliberately erased. And I believe that was by design. And so there's this book called Dangerous Voices. It's women's laments and Greek literature. And the author, Gail, I can't remember her last name right now, but she explains basically, and I kind of just assumed that this story probably was pretty applicable to all of Europe in many ways. But she explains how professional mourners in ancient Greece were silenced because their public grieving practices threatened social and political order. So these laments that were often performed by women and non-binary folks, they challenged authority because it reinforced kinship ties over loyalty to the state, and had the power to stir collective grief that could lead to unrest and actually resistance. So I think, basically what she's trying to explain to us is that the suppression of these practices was driven by a need for political control. Basically, there was this shift towards state-controlled mourning, and in that shift, it was like, okay, so instead of having these communal grief-based practices that are earth-based, and they really show us that the insanity of sending people to war, because that's what like grief does. It highlights the insanity of these things, or the like collective, we're not okay with this. In that shift, it like shifted to more of like patriotic funerals that like justified people going to war. So it was part of a broader cultural shift away from old earth-based traditions of grief, and instead towards, yeah, rationalism and order.
You're reminding me of this book I read called Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici,
Yes.
which for me,
Yes.
as a Swiss and Swedish woman, was such a sort of an eye-opening book about, oh yes, the first people who were colonized were my people, and actually my home state in Switzerland, my canton, it's a state, um, was, I believe, the state where the most amounts of witch burnings happened in Europe at some point in time.
Wow.
And yeah, it was the tearing away of the woman from the land, and then all of these things that sort of we then exported the violence externally, and it's important that you couched mourning and grief within this much wider, deep cultural loss and deficit. This idea of like a professional mourner, is that the sense that like, so these women, and I think you wrote also in your article about the mekonanet, um, I'm not sure if that's exactly the professional mourners, but um, is that because people, like, obviously even back then, would get stuck and we would need people to come along? Like I read somewhere that in the Arabic world you had these wailers that would attend funerals that would like help unlock the collective. So even back then, even when everything was like much more, let's say, organic or connected, we still needed help to grieve.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Mekonenet is from the Hebrew lineage. And she was often a woman, or I always say, not, I always throw in non-binary people. Like all these academics are talking about, well, there were women, women, women. I'm like, there were probably non-binary folks and women. Um, so the Mekonenet was, I see her today as an archetype, but she was a professional mourner, and she, through wailing and song and lament, she would bridge these liminal spaces between the living and the dead. And she would probably do today something like how we might recognize ritual theater, um, often serving as, she's like a catalyst for metabolization, and she often would serve as we and my, like, the folks of this region, Pacific Northwest region, where I'm situated geographically, we call folks like that permissionaries. It's like they give others permission through their own action to also express in a certain or particular way. um, and then I think another role that they would hold is that they would channel often unmetabolized grief in the collective field when it couldn't move through others. So it was almost like a shamanic kind of role in many ways.
That's a very brave role to hold. I remember once I was doing a meditation, and when I was living in Mexico, it must have been like a solstice or an equinox, like one of these moments of the year. And I was just sitting on the floor of my room and just lit a candle and dropped in. And all of a sudden, I just started crying, and I couldn't
Mm.
understand what was happening. And um, it was one of the first times in my life I understood that, like, I was like, I'm not crying for me. There's like a deeper cry of the earth. Like, these tears are
Mhm.
not mine. It's something that's not me, but I'm crying for the earth. And it was, so I have a small sense of what's that like, what that is like. And then that kind of leads me to ask, when we look at the context today, and as you specified importantly, like the Western context, do you think that's what is needed, are these professional mourners to come back, or for community to like learn how to heal together? And as I was even formulating that question, the thought came to me, or like, is that one and the same, and we kind of need both?
Right. Yeah. I mean, communal grieving can't exist without the community. And I see healers and artists and culture shifters and facilitators, as those who are supporting a process that requires the will of both the individual and or the collective. So in this way, the community itself is the healer. The individual is the healer, being supported by, say, a guide. In other words, the facilitator, or if we want to say the professional mourner in this case, acts as a door, but is not the doer, because the doing is done by the will of the collective or the
Mm.
individual. And I have this sticker that I like to give away to friends that says something like, I urge the collective to take public grieving to the streets as a form of activism, as an act of nonviolent civil disobedience. Because as I started us off in the beginning of this conversation, it's a
Mm-hmm.
form of resistance. And we know that because when we look to history, some of what we've just touched on, we understand why these practices were abolished, and we recognize that the power of collective grieving was seen as a direct threat to the state, and the massacres and unbearable injustices that they continue to inflict.
So I've never participated yet in a collective kind of grieving ritual. I'm excited. I think I'll participate in one of yours soon this year. The image that comes to mind for me, and maybe it's the same for some of people who are listening, it's like I'm just imagining a room full of people crying and howling. And like, is that like, just before we even go further in the conversation, like when we
Mm.
talk about like a communal grieving process or grieving in public spaces, like are there like archetypes or different even images of what that looks like? Is it different every time, or is there like
Mm.
just always a room of people crying?
Totally, yeah. A lot of people who haven't attended the rituals often ask that, they're like, I don't have context for this. So what does that look like? Um, and for for myself, I there's a 2-day grief ritual that me and my elder Lawrence Cole holds, but then I also do like 2-hour song circles, right? And in both of these contexts, grief is being invoked, and moved, and those two things do look completely different contextually.
Mm.
But the grief ritual that we do, it's kind of like, um, basically 30 to 36 strangers mostly coming into this space together. And we start in ways on the first day, just what we call cooking the ritual. And so it's basically several invitations for people to start to get more agile, more in touch, befriend grief, right? Like as Francis Weller says, we live in this grief illiterate, grief phobic society culture. So we kind of like, if we were to talk about it, like kind of like grief 101, like how can we talk about it? How does it live in our bodies? Like what does it look like to embody the grief and express that? So we kind of walk people through group harvesting together to listen to each other, because one of the most powerful things for me in group harvesting is, um, how often I hear the majority of what's being spoken into the space by different people. Like, I'm like, oh, me too. I feel that too. And yet I have never had the words to articulate that before. And someone else is articulating it. And that helps me metabolize. And so, that's just one of the many benefits of doing this collectively. But as the day goes on, there, grief starts to move through people because we've invoked it. And by the time we get to the evening portion, which is when we start to move into the Dagara ritual, which was brought over from Burkina Faso, um, I think a lot of people who haven't done it before are taken by surprise, because it's one thing when you're in a room full of people and you just have like maybe a couple people crying over here or you hear wailing over there. But in the evening, we move into darkness and we kind of set up the whole room with all these shrines and altars. And the drums start. So there's drumming and singing the entire time. And all the grief is directed in one direction. And every time you decide to go to the grief shrine, no one ever goes alone. You are always accompanied by a witness. And there's protocol around that, and we go over all of that. But some people ask, like, they raise their hand and they're like, well, what if I want to go in alone? Like, what if I don't want to? It's like, no, that's actually not what we're doing here. And so, I kind of see this ritual as a kind of like a remapping of neural pathways in our brain of the ways that we have been conditioned to cry alone or grieve alone or do it alone. And in fact, there's a song I have that is inspired by Francis Weller's Third Gate of Grief that's called One Body. And it says, I don't know if we were meant to carry so much grief in one body, which, yeah. Um, and I think that one of the most beautiful pieces about communal grieving, which we have forgotten and we're walking our way towards remembering, is that when we're talking about these systems of oppression or unmetabolized collective grief that like genocides, for example, that's not something one person can do on their own, nor is it one person's responsibility. It must be held collectively. um so that's a very kind of like brief brief version of what it could look like in there, and I would invite us here to listen to One Body a little bit.
Ahlay, that was such an evocative description of what the ritual looks and feels like. And I'm wondering, um, people walk in with assumptions. I need to grieve alone, or even just like the vulnerability of crying in front of someone, like it's taken me time to be comfortable with that personally myself. And I'm curious, what you've done quite a few of these now, and what are some of the kinds of patterns you see in terms of when people leave by the end? What have they been surprised by? They came in with assumptions, something surprised them, they're leaving with something, right? It's hard to have generalities, but I'm sure there's some. Like, what are some of the patterns you see in that?
One thing I notice is how deeply people feel connected to the group by the end of the second day. I mean, we're talking about day one is probably a long day. It's probably about 12 hours with some breaks and, rest breaks. And then the second day is, maybe 8 hours. But by the time we get to the end of the second day, like the juxtaposition and the contrast of how people are kind of like reserved or tight and stiff in the body when they first walk in the room, and it's almost kind of like someone might have sucked the air out of the room, and just like the fluidity that lives in the room towards the end of the second day. There's often it feels like, first of all, it feels to many of us like yesterday morning, and I'm talking about the end of the second day, happened like 2 weeks ago. It feels like forever ago. Like, how is it possible that that was just yesterday? And so there's often like a strong shared resonance, of sense of connection that builds in the group field. And I often hear people say things in our closing circle like, I didn't know grieving together could be like this. Like, it sounds very simple, but when you've gone through it, it's like, yeah. I didn't know that strangers from yesterday could become so familiar to me in such a short amount of time. It's like, there's the power of vulnerability, right? Like, what vulnerability can open our hearts towards. I often hear people say like, I feel like I love you all, and it's like, 18 hours later. So it's profoundly moving, and honestly, it's often what keeps me going in this particular work. The lived experience that grief can be the glue of the community is what Sabomfu Somé would say. Grief is the glue of community.
Obviously, if you're attending a workshop that wasn't your pre-existing community, so do you find that people like are then like, hey, Ahlay, like how can I bring this like back to my community, and can I train in it? Or sort of, I'm sure there's like a post epiphanic hangover where you're like, okay, but now how do I do this again?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely people who are like, I've seen them like 5, 6, 7 times. And it's not like they're stuck in a loop. It's more like they know that this is like soul hygiene, which is what Francis Weller calls it. It's a commitment to return again and again and again and again, because grief isn't something that we get over, right? We're trying to build a relationship with this one that we have been told to repress or put away. And so, yeah, I've found that in this past year and a half, more and more people are coming, asking like, how do we apprentice to you particularly? And that's something that I'm deeply sitting with on many levels. And there's, some of the elders here in the Pacific Northwest, they have a mentoring program that they just wrapped up one iteration of last week, where 50 people went through it together. Francis Weller has a lot of online trainings where like 800 to 1,000 people are showing up. I mean, I feel like there's definitely a tapping in of a collective conscious, where it's like, even if we don't exactly know why, and it also is so clear and obvious, but more and more people know that this work is needed, and that yeah, it can't just be a small few of people who feel like they can hold this. And I also like to tell people that, you know, it you don't have to you don't have to have a certain like yeah, there's no like certificate for this. I feel like it's more like a calling. And so what I often invite people into is saying, like, if you know this is important and that you need it, call in your community, and when they show up, say, hey, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this, but I know we need this, and I know it's important, and can we remember this together? And then it kind of like lifts this weight and responsibility off this one or two people to have to hold everyone, and instead invite the community into holding each other, because that's ultimately what we're remembering how to do.
100%. I just started taking Francis's course. The name is something like it's around climate grief, and sort of it's like grief for the climate aware, which has been really interesting so far. I mean, I've just done the first session or so, but he even said, like, you can just call your 3 to 4 best friends or close friends and just like once a month, like have a moment where you talk about it. I think what's been like interesting for me to observe, as you know, I think we spoke about this a bit beforehand. I've lost my father. Well, lost. I don't even like that language. My father's transitioned recently to another space, and it's been a very profound door and sort of initiation and all the things. But what I've noticed is like grief is so different depending what you're grieving and even who you're grieving, right? And so my grief for my father is not the same as what my mother's grieving, which is a spouse. And it's not the same as someone who's grieving the coral. And so there's probably indescribable amounts of, different types of grief, and they are quite unique. And in a way, like, there's a feeling of like, oh yeah, I understand that, but mine's quite different. And people sometimes share their story and you're like, oh, it's not quite my story. And that's cool that you're trying to be helpful, but like, it's a bit different over here. So how do you hold that in the context of a group container where there is such specificity in what someone's, experiencing, but we're all here for grief as the emotion, but there's no one emotion that we're even actually all here for?
Right. Yeah, that's a really important question, and I have been thinking about that for a long time, of reflecting on this idea that I often hear many people in grief tending spaces say, that there's no hierarchy of grief. And I'm sitting with that because I don't know if I agree with that, honestly. So I think I'm gonna like say this. I'm gonna answer this as like a thought in progress, not as like I know this, but it's like what I'm thinking about. While I agree that we shouldn't rank grief and say like your grief doesn't matter as much because it doesn't compare to this or that, like I don't think that that's the right way to go about it. I think often there's like people that show up in spaces who do say, Like, I actually don't feel comfortable sharing my grief because it doesn't feel like it compares to all of what else I've heard spoken into the space. And that's a really vulnerable place to be too, because everyone's grief matters, actually. But I also recognize that there's a difference between, for example, right? It's different than the example you gave, but for example, the grief caused by institutions that target people through racial profiling, right? Murdering civilians, that is like justified by the law or some egregious unfounded reasoning, right? Versus like the grief that I feel watching my daughter age and like knowing, oh my gosh, she's never going to be 8 again, and like really having a deep grief around that. And so I think the key point here isn't about comparing or invalidating one grief over the other. I think it's more about naming the reality that just like death knows no borders, right? And holds no prejudices or favorites. Like, everyone's going to eventually die. Everything we love, we will lose. In that same vein, I believe that neither does the way that unmetabolized grief manifests in the body. So it's like, regardless, like when we repress our grief, regardless of its origins, it simply doesn't disappear. So it can come out sideways, affecting those we love, right? Again, regardless of the origin, regardless of how or why or any of that, it can come out horizontally, affecting those that we love the most, our colleagues, our communities. And then on like a larger scale, this is what we see happening with intergenerational trauma. The ways it repeats and amplifies until someone or a collective decides to metabolize it together. So that's like where I'm currently at when I think about like, how do we hold all of these different things together. I think about more like the way that it manifests in the body, and that what we're here to do is to move it through our bodies together regardless of the origin of it.
Mm-hmm. And probably, I mean, I've seen that you've created this in some of your retreats or workshops. Like, I've seen that you've hosted like grief for this particular demographic, and I think there's probably an advantage to a collective thing where I've been in other workshops where you're in a circle and you're like, wow, like, yeah, their thing is my thing, and there's a value to the complete kind of meshing of a space. And then I'm sure there's a value of like, okay, let's mourn, as you've said, like, this version of white supremacy, or let's mourn genocide, or let's mourn like climate collapse, because like I remember when I was listening to a thing that Francis Weller said, he said like climate grief in a way is irresolvable because it's just what we're going to be in, right? And maybe other types of grief are different. So there's probably value in all of that. And what you say about repressing the grief, I did an episode on eco-anxiety with Britt Ray some episodes ago in the podcast. And there I quoted quite a few things around Joanna Macy and others where they say, like, if we don't tap into the grief or the sadness, then we're more paralyzed towards the action like that needs to be taken. I'm curious if you'd want to like contribute or add any nuance to that. Like you say, it lives in the body, it can get stuck, it can come out weirdly and orthogonally, like with the people around us. You're suddenly like shouting at someone in the airport queue. But like collectively, and maybe even in a Western culture or not, like globally, like why do these kinds of rituals and spaces matter? Like, or, if we didn't do them, what do you think would happen?
I mean, I'm just thinking right now of one of the teachers and storytellers that many of us look to for this particular work, Martin Prechtel, and he says that all war is unmetabolized grief.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm currently sitting at an intersection where I'm getting more and more curious about how grief rituals can be in service to two sides of a conflict. Even if the goal is to just reach each other's humanity for a glimpse. It's like when you go into ceremony or church or plant ceremony, or you catch glimpses of, at least I do, I catch literally fragmented moments or seconds of what's possible when I tap into the deepest source of love. And I think that these grief rituals, I think what they're doing is they're, you know, we talk about how um, people are often afraid of the loud expressions of grief, um, because those are often attached to stories and younger and wounded parts of ourselves from maybe when we were little. And it was scary to hear, like when we heard wailing or raging, like there was violence happening and it was scary. And so we're talking about in these spaces, like, can you pause for a moment when that's starting to come up for you and remind yourself, like from the adult part of yourself in this moment, that these are, in this moment, that these are the sounds of healing, actually. And can you lean into that river? And so I think what happens when people do say yes and they lean into that resistance, or they lean into that place of, this feels scary and unknown to me, or it feels very known to me, but I want to lean into the possibility that could be something different. And then they allow what lives in their body to move through them, through just by being in the space, or by witnessing, as I spoke to earlier, these permissionaries, perhaps like other people who are doing something that I might see this person be like, hey, I want to try that on. I want to try out what that person is doing with their body right now. Um, and then, you know, maybe even like fake it till you make it sort of thing. Like I'm going to practice. I'm just like, what we're doing is we're practicing. We're learning by witnessing each other. And so, yeah, I think that, the metabolization or the decalcification of what has been stuck in the body for, it could be decades, literally decades. It could be lifetimes, because there's so much ancestral stuff in the room too. Um, that there's a feeling coming out on the other side often. I won't say always, because for me, a lot of the time, I even feel heavier sometimes afterwards, because there's still stuff that it's like when you're doing a detox, you know, it's like there's still a lot of stuff and gunk and sediment that's old, that got moved around and needs to move through. But I think that that's why we talk about, it's not like you go once and you got it out and you're good now. It is a practice of continuing to do it, because especially within the conditions that we live in today, where there's just like bad news everywhere all the time, so much suffering, and it is an act of cleansing the body. And that's part of why I think, for me personally, what I'm trying to encourage people to do is like, well, we come here to be in this like intensive together, this intensive practice of like, you know, very condensed time together to be with our grief. But ideally what we're trying, the goal is that grief becomes a part of our daily life. And I can move through a wave of grief 10 or 15 times in a day, but that's the thing, it doesn't knock me out anymore. It's like, I'm not afraid of it. I've created a relationship with it. So, okay, here it is. It's moving through. It might last 10 minutes. It might last 10 seconds. I might need a little bit longer, but then I'm able to like continue on with my day and oscillate through several other emotions. And so um, I think what Maladoma and Sobonfu would often talk about is how grief melts the ice around a frozen heart and it softens us. And so I do think that it radically changes the way that we are able to be in interdependence with each other when we tend to our grief.
That's so beautifully said. Um, the very mundane metaphor parallel of that would be like you go to like your hygienist like once a year and you get like the full dental thing, but you're brushing your teeth every day. You're flossing hopefully
Exactly.
once a week, you know, like there's like a maintenance of the hygiene. I just thought of it because use that word. So as a sort of bridge to speak about the role of song and choir and music in all of this, which is something so uniquely beautiful that you're bringing to the space, I want to bridge that with a question around like something that you wrote once. Let me just find it. You said, yeah, what does it mean for our grief to be a conscious offering to the land? Question mark. What does it mean for the healing of human and land not to be separate?
Mm.
I think about that because, you know, your first, this album was about the whales. So I'm thinking about land and creatures. So can you go into that? Like, are you talking about acknowledging the grief of a landscape in ritual, or how then does that maybe even tie in some of the content you've chosen to do around your music?
Mm-hmm. You tapped into it even in what you shared a little earlier about this time that you went and sat with a candle and just grief started moving through you, right? Um, I think as many indigenous teachings remind us, we are not separate from the land. And in fact, the belief that we are is one of the root causes of the ecological crisis we're facing,
Mm.
as you know. And yeah, Joanna Macy will talk about how we are the earth protecting itself or themself, herself, whatever pronoun you want to use there. And I deeply resonate with that. And there's an activist and scholar named Lila June, who I adore, who beautifully reminds us that humans are an integral part of the ecosystem, that we've just collectively forgotten our true role in the symbiotic relationship between species. Um, and so I'll often hear people channeling the land's grief or the grief of the ancestors of a place, myself included. And I hear it often described as like vast and bottomless, like a depth that feels too immense to carry alone. And as I mentioned before, this is where communal grieving also has a great impact, especially with something as vast as the polycrisis that we're facing. The weight of all that we individually carry, ecological, social, ancestral, etc., it's just simply too big to bear alone. So um, if we are able to stay with the possibility that we are the land, that we are not separate from the land, that we're perhaps like an octopus, we might, like, the if the earth was the octopus head, that we're one of its tentacles, like of
Mm.
course we're feeling. And the conscious mind, you know, because of colonization, like really wants us to be able to understand that and like explain it, but we're not going to be able to do that. Like, we have to trust that the body, so many books have showed us now, you know, the body keeps the score, the body knows. And so I think that is like a more advanced level of grief practice, is when we let our mind literally take a witness seat and let what wants to move through the body, especially in relationship to land and spirits of that place.
Wow, it's the feeling that comes to me is like what an honor if we can actually offer our bodies to the earth in that way. It feels like the ultimate gift for everything the earth has given us, and you know, literally from the nutrients to the blood. How, you know, may we serve in that way. So on the music side, you know, you started from singing alone, then you went to a band, and now you're how will I say, hosting these song ceremonies or song circles, which can be 30 to 100 plus people in circle singing together. And you've said, these are invitations to move stagnated emotions in the body, which you've just spoken about just now. Maybe you can tell us about WAILS, Songs for Grief,
Mm-hmm.
A 200 voice community choir for an album dedicated to grief, inspired by the WAILS and Francis Weller's work. I love this album. This was actually what connected me to you originally. I don't even know how it showed up on my Spotify or how I found it, but I listened to the whole album, which is how it's supposed to be listened to, right? Like front, like beginning to end. Please tell us about that. I am such a fangirl of what you created there.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. What do you want to know? There's so many directions I could go in.
Okay, let's start with why the whales, like why the creatures, and then how did you pull together a whole choir to sing for and with the whales?
Yeah. Well, okay, the whales, I could go for hours and hours and hours about this. Whales have been, yeah, they've kind of raised me in many ways. I was born in Coast Salish territory, Pacific Northwest, the Salish Sea, kind of also known as Seattle, Washington area in the United States, Turtle Island, and um, there are a ton of whales here, orca and humpback, and for many of my younger years, it was really orca whale that was kind of like a guide for me. And then when I was 18, I left Washington State and moved south, and then was in California for 2 years, and then moved after that to Mexico for 11 years. So I was very like in a very different environment than I had grown up in. And while I was in these, what I would say like more like high desert, drier areas, I was very far away from the ocean. And so the whales would come to me in my dreams. It was kind of weird if I woke up one day and they weren't in my dreams. It was more like that. But I mean, yeah, I mean, there if you've ever seen the film Whale Rider, which is my absolute favorite film, like beyond all other film, like there's nothing close to that film and how much I have reverence for it. But it's about a Maori girl who has this deep relationship through her ancestral lineage of relationship to the whales. And it there's this scene where she's like, the Maori have this way of greeting each other by putting their foreheads to forehead to forehead and like nose to nose. There's this scene where she does this with the barnacle of a beached whale, and then the next scene you see she's like literally on the back of that whale riding the whale. And so these were like my dreams. Like I'm having dreams of this sort of kind of connection and relationship with these beings. And on like more of a maybe mytho-poetic kind of thread of the whales, um, for me they've always been these dwellers of the unseen realms, because when we can basically see them when they pop up above, we see them when they're above water, but to me they're like these guides of the unknown or the underworld. And yet, as deep as they go, they're mammals and they have to come back up for air. um and so it reminds me that in order to sustainably navigate the depths, that I have to find this balance of like coming back up for air and going back down into the depths and coming back up for air. um
And they're
and so
singers just like you.
and they're singers, especially the humpbacks. Yeah. And so the whales have the largest hearts on the planet. Like a blue whale's heart is the same, like is as big as a VW beetle. You could get inside the heart of a blue whale. Um, And so and so for me, they're just like heart medicine. They're like such an expression of vast love, especially in these times. Um, so for me, they're these guides of what it means to keep loving even in the face of such violence and adversity and extreme rage towards decisions being made by people we actually didn't really want to be making our decisions. So how did I call people in? That's a really good question. Um, yeah, I guess there's a part of me that like wants to take credit or like responsibility, right? There's like a part of me that wants to take responsibility for being the vessel, for living in this human body that's like, I'm the one taking initiative and calling people in, and I cannot take credit for this. I really do feel like the WAILS asked this project to happen. They used me as a vessel for this project. And people were, of course, coming because they trust me and they know my music, but also because they trust the WAILS. And I can't even say like how many people I've connected with since putting this project out that are like deep whale medicine people. And it's like I'm finding my people. I'm like, where have you been my whole life? But yeah, I put out a call and was like, for me, whales are teaching me how to navigate grief, going into the depths, coming and breathing through my body, and being able to go that deep because I'm breathing. And yeah, so I wrote a song for each gate inspired by Five Gates of Grief from Francis Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And I just told people I want these songs to not just be my voice, but be all of our voice, because it is about communal grieving. And so I need a community on this album. And so, yeah, I called in 200 people to come take this wild experiment with me. And I made a gathering out of it. And I called in a lot of my really close friends who are other song leaders and anti-racist facilitators and psychodrama facilitators. And we came together for 4 days, 200, more than 200. There was like 220 of us. And we went through this whole weekend experience together. It wasn't one of those gatherings where it's like, oh, all these 6 different things are happening. Like, which one am I going to go to? It was like we had a group experience the whole time together. And within that time, we had 3 like studio days where we recorded these songs inside of a lodge. And I had this awesome team of people who stepped in to help me, Todd and Max and Shireen. And we just, I don't know how we did it. We did it. And every day people would come to me at the end of the day and be like, this is amazing. Like, it's going so well. How are you feeling? And I was just like, please ask me that the day after it's over, because I was always waiting for something to go wrong. Like, I was just like, I just know what happens when we come together. Like, shit happens, And so it didn't somehow magically, like for that one. It was truly life changing. And I think, like the album's out now and people are meeting the album for the first time just as like this album. But it was like the journey to make that album was life changing for a lot of us. Yeah.
Is there a different sort of purpose, if I can use that word, that like community choir collective singing serves versus some of the other grief rituals you've described?
It's hard to kind of parse them out. I mean, I feel like the potential in both of them is so similar. I think that the one difference that I'm noticing is the I've been calling the song circles kind of like like you have the gateway drugs, that they talk about. I feel like it's kind of like the gateway to the grief ritual. Yeah, it's like a
Yeah.
place where people might feel a little more accessibility to be curious and maybe a little hesitant about, and then once they experience the power of that and maybe even a trust in my facilitation, or then they might get a little more curious about like, wait, what else is this person doing?
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I'm going to play a piece now from that album, where, as you said, and as you've written, it should be listened beginning to end, and I can vouch for that myself. But if we're to pull out a part that people can get a sense of, which one shall it be? Just cue us up so then I'll play it. Too hard? You can veto the question.
Yeah, I think I would go for Bloodlines, when the choir comes in together. So it's like halfway through that song.
Okay. I think it's just interesting to have a snippet of it, but I hear you. It's like I'm a writer. That's how I express creativity, and so like when someone like takes a sentence out of a piece, I'm like, no, it doesn't exist with all the other stuff. So you made a face. So I respect that, but still, I think just vocally it's beautiful. And you've got a new album coming out as well, new anthems for the apocalypse. Is that similar in energy? Is it sort of on behalf
No.
of ecosystems or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not recording it with a full choir like I
Mhm.
did. I have a song called "Carry This All" that's on Spotify, and it's more kind of like in that vein of production. Working on it with a friend of mine named Michael Linder, who's just total dorky genius that like sits in his room and like just little, yeah, I feel like he's in a spaceship like doing magic and like a little wizard in there. So him and I are working on it, and yeah, it's called Anthems for an Apocalypse. And I was just like, what are the songs that I would want to have in my witchy like cauldron as things are collapsing, that I would want to be able to sing with people on the street corners.
Mm.
Um, and so that's kind of like the invitation for me as an artist to be like, okay, so what are those songs? And those are the songs coming through right now. I would love to share one with you that you could share on this, just like a little snippet of one. Um, but one of the songs that is on this album is called All the Places. And this is the song I'd love to share with you for this podcast. And the lyrics to this song say, "May all the places that have yet to know love, may they know love, may they know love, may they know love." And this song comes through as a prayer to a little bit what we were touching on earlier about how Malidoma and Sabonfu talk about grief being kind of this warmth that comes to the frozen heart and melts the ice around the frozen heart. And so this song is kind of speaking into those places, um, that there's like a lot of protection around for whatever reason, being like, no, don't let the love in here. Because if the love comes in here, that will change everything. And that's what this song is for. It's for the places in ourselves that have yet to know love, and it's for the places in the collective that have yet to know love. And really, it's an offering to my perceived enemy. It's like when I see someone doing something that I want to scream at the top of my lungs, or I feel rage, or I have no way of compensating or understanding what it is that's making them do that. I am a witch, so I believe that whatever I cast upon someone comes back to me 3 times. So what spells am I going to cast? And so this is the spell that I choose to cast upon these ones. because I also want all the parts of me that have yet to know love to know love. And I feel that if I see this song as like, if I were to visualize what this is, it's for me it's honey. It's like the way honey can like move into, or water, right? Like the way it knows how to move into the tiniest cracks, it just makes its way in there. And it's such like a benevolent force. And so I just envision, like, as I'm looking at this perceived enemy of like, may all the places in you that have yet to know love, may they know love. Like, may it bring you to your knees in humility, and may it melt you into compassion. May it remind you of your humanity and mine. So that's kind of like the basis of what this next album is.
So many images came to mind there. I want to go back to something you said in the beginning around like public acts of grief or mourning being like the activism or the insurgency in themselves. And as you're describing and thinking about the love frequency of the whales, these huge hearts that resonate throughout the oceans. The previous guest before you, the episode right before, she's Faya. She's a Maori whale rider. So I love that you mentioned that. So
What?
it's really cool that these two episodes are going together. But yeah, the word that's coming up for me is like love activism, or what does that look like? And I'm reminded by this myth that I'm sure you know about the lindworm. And I would go way over time of this episode if I was to tell the myth, although it needs a good campfire and a hot cup of mead and crackling branches. So but I'll link a version of the myth in the show notes. I'll find a good one. The essence of it, and I guess this is what is it when you say disclaimer, punchline is included. It's a story about how love can melt the most like aggressive and terrifying of forces, and that when you use that love to melt, in this case, it's this mythic big worm that's the brother of the one who's cast out the kingdom, but and he's and he so this big sort of crazy mythic beast lindworm is slowly worn down by taking off his clothes, and what's inside, it's like a young crying child, right? And I think when you're talking about something getting in the cracks, it's like there's often just like a really hurt little child where something wasn't quite loved, and that is the force. Or I'm thinking about Aikido and a story that was told about Aikido, how like sometimes it's just the gentleness that actually it's not the force. So I think I'm going to close this episode by thanking you and saying goodbye, and then just playing the song, and that will be the end. That will be the end of the episode. So that will play right afterwards. And unless you have do you have a closing word or statement? I just want to thank you, and then I'll move into your song. But if there's anything else you want to share, and just to feel completion.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I would love to say is just that I like to make up stories as a way to help me navigate this insanity. And I like to believe that mystery, who for me is God, mystery, the great unknown. I like to believe that mystery tucked these practices, these grieving, communal ways of grieving, kind of tuck these practices deep into the earth, burying them strategically, waiting for the right moment to emerge, ready to sprout and rise when the world needs them the most. And I believe that moment is now. And I see it like these waves, these vast and powerful waves of my human kin answering to the call and like heeding to this call to tend to communal grief as a true response to the times that we're living in. And not one moment before. Like it feels like, yeah, there was no more right moment than now. And so I'm just really wanting to offer gratitude to those who are feeling the call to serve their communities in this way. And also to those who are willing to remember this practice together.
A deep bow to everything you just said. It's beautiful.
Mm.
Thank you, Ahlay.
Mm.
And I'll link in the notes where people can find you, rituals, get in touch. It's all there, so we don't need to get into technicalities when we're ending on such a poetic note. I'm so grateful you made the time. Thank you for coming on. And so as we close this episode, I'll end repeating some of Ahlay's words that kind of read as a prayer. She said, "May all the places in you that have yet to know love, may they know love. May you be brought to your knees, and may you melt into compassion."